National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. This is our mini-episode where I will hone in on some of the finer points from last week's main episode. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and today I'll be continuing our discussion on the 1943 film Guadalcanal Diary. The film centers on the initial landings on Guadalcanal, the capture of the airfield, and the subsequent routing of Japanese ashore, all done in typical wartime rousing style. Guadalcanal Diary stars William Bendix as Taxi, Preston Foster as Father Donnelly, Lloyd Nolan as Sergeant Malone, Anthony Quinn, Richard Jackal, and many others. The film was directed by Louis Seiler, produced by Brian Foy, and written by Lamar Trotty and Jerome Cady, based off of the book of the same name written by Richard Tregaskis. Guadalcanal Diary was a box office success and received positive reviews at the time of its release.
We were so young and so stupid, and we had no concept of what war was supposed to be like or anything. No, we were not nervous. We figured that somebody knew what was supposed to be done and that the good Lord would take care of us. But as far as sitting around chewing on our fingernails, there wasn't any of that at all.
That was the voice of my good friend and well-known Marine, Dr. Sid Phillips. Dr. Sid served with H-21 H Company 2nd Battalion 1st Marines and was among the first to land on the beach at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. We'll hear more from Dr. Sid in just a few minutes. The invasion of Guadalcanal was the first major offensive operation of the Pacific War, and as it was a rushed-together operation in our very first one, it didn't start off as well as we would have hoped. Following the victory at Midway, American staff officers began speaking of, quote, great plans, unquote, to capitalize on the American victory at Midway and hurl the Japanese all the way back to the country from which they came. All in a brief period of time, of course, starting with Rabaul, Japan's most ferocious and precious territory in the South Pacific. A bit, shall we say, ambitious on the part of the American planners. Over a period of roughly 6 weeks, plans for an offensive in the South Pacific slowly began to focus on the area around Tulagi. It wasn't until July 5th, a little more than a month before the landings did occur on Guadalcanal, did Guadalcanal become an actual objective for the 1st Marine Division. And to be frank, the only reason that it was ever added anyway was because intelligence had reported that an airfield was being built there by the Japanese. The operation was called Operation Watchtower, and as we will learn, the Marines would soon call it Operation Shoestring. Speaking of Marines, the unit slated to land on Guadalcanal was the newly formed 1st Marine Division, and of that unit, only the 1st and 5th Regiments were to land on D-Day, as the 7th Marines were garrisoning Samoa against the Japanese invasion. One of the men aboard the transport, George F. Elliott, on his way to Guadalcanal, was a young Marine from outside Mobile, Alabama, named Sidney Phillips. Sid had joined the Marines shortly after Pearl Harbor, been sent to Parris Island for his boot camp, instructed in the use of heavy weapons, and assigned to the aforementioned H-21. Sid and his comrades had made a cross-country trip via slow-moving train to California, where they embarked on the George F. Elliott and shipped out. They stopped in Wellington, New Zealand to combat load their ships, made one practice landing, which went horribly awry, by the way, and headed back to sea, bound for God knows where. Let's hear what Sid has to say about life aboard the Elliott on his way to battle.
The life aboard a troop ship is so bad that you're anxious to get off of that damn troop ship. It doesn't matter if you're blown off of it. But you know, you're packed in there like sardines. You are on that thing week after week after week with no freshwater showers, no way to wash your clothes, 2 meals a day, and the food is just indescribable. There'll be cream chip beef on toast, which was known as SOS, you know, and then you'll stand in line 4 hours to get that, and there'll be a very small helping of it. You nearly starve to death on a troop ship, and we were really happy to get off of that thing, even if it meant we were going to be killed. We weren't nervous. We just wanted off of that troop ship.
Sid and his buddies weren't told much about the upcoming invasion. As a matter of fact, they weren't told anything at all, really, regarding intel. The intel had the island incorrectly labeled as Guadalcanal on maps. The first couple of waves of Marines expected to run into fierce opposition and were told that most of them would be killed as soon as they stepped off the landing craft. As it was, that was not the case. The initial landings in the first few hours aboard Guadalcanal could not have gone better. Paltry resistance was met, and the overall objective for the operation, the airfield, now dubbed Henderson Field, was captured within the first 2 hours. Battle won, let's all go home. Not so fast. Over the next few weeks, life aboard Guadalcanal, or the canal as it was called, turned into a living nightmare. Combat with the Japanese was sporadic and not every day by any means. But when there were fights, they were fierce. Sid's unit H-21 was one of 2 Marine companies along the Tinaroo River, Elu River, Alligator Creek, whatever you want to call it, on the night of August 21st, when over 1,100 Japanese made a direct frontal assault on fixed Marine rifle and machine gun positions. The results were predictable and provided the Marines with their first major victory against the Japanese, as Sid and his comrades slaughtered the elite Ichiki Battalion almost to the man. Following the action at the Tinaroo, H Company was pulled off the line. However, their life and the lives of most Marines on Guadalcanal did not allow for rest. Let's continue to listen to Dr. Sid as he talks about working parties on the canal.
When we left the Tinaroo area, we were given that new sector at the end of the fighter strip. And it's difficult to imagine the tremendous work that would have to go into fortifying a new sector. Lots of trees had to be cut down. Cut down trees had to be moved, burned, or whatever, but you wanted as clean a field of fire as you could get. You did not want to be able to provide hiding places for the Japanese if you were run over by them. So we were always cleaning the ground and trying to have clean fields of fire. You never rested on Guadalcanal. There was always a working party, always a project going on, and even up there in the ridges, we would dig trenches, joining one position with another, so that you would have a place to have cover. Our lieutenant wanted the place camouflaged, and we would dig up clumps of grass and spread them around in bare spots to try to camouflage where we were a little bit. So you never were allowed to sit down and rest. It seemed like there was always something going on, always some project going on, and always a working party. You got a working party every other day, either on the beach, or maybe occasionally you could get to go aboard a ship, which was great. We loved to get to go aboard a ship because then you could trade souvenirs for food and all. So at night you were always back in your position on your perimeter, and the perimeter was fully manned at night, every night.
Working parties, while certainly an unwelcome event in the lives of the Marines ashore, were not the bane of their existence. That moniker would fall under the titles of lack of food, tropical diseases, and the Japanese, of course. Following the Navy's disastrous August defeat at Savo Island, the Marine supplies, or at least the vast majority of them, were pulled away from the island. The men ashore were left without sufficient medical provisions and very little of their own food. Following their rapid capture of the airfield the day after landing, the Marines seized large stores of Japanese rice. Rice became the main item on the menu until early November for the Marines ashore. If one asked any early veteran of the campaign about food, the veteran would almost certainly mention the lack of food and the constant daily rations of the maggot and worm-infested rice issued to them by the 1st Marine Division's cooks, who ate the same unappetizing 2-tablespoon meal day after day. Combined with the hot, humid weather, the stress of combat, and the inadequate diet, the men ashore lost weight at an acute rate. The Marines ashore, children of the Great Depression, were already thin and soon became downright skinny. It was not uncommon for men on Guadalcanal to lose as much as 40 pounds due to malnutrition and tropical diseases. Guadalcanal's humid weather and wet jungle terrain created a perfect breeding ground for disease. Clouds of malaria-carrying mosquitoes were a constant threat for any man ashore. The men were instructed to take an anti-malaria drug called Atibrine in order to ward off the disease. When taken regularly, Atibrine proved to be somewhat effective. However, rumors began to circulate among the men taking Atibrine that it would eventually make them sterile and render them sexually impotent. The rumors were untrue, of course, but that didn't change the fact that many a Marine would spit out the little yellow pill once out of the sight of the Navy corpsman who administered it. Malaria cases were rampant on Guadalcanal in the autumn of 1942, so much so that having malaria became a sort of badge of honor among those who served on the island. It is estimated that by the time the division was relieved in December 1942, over 8,000 men of the 1st Marine Division had malaria. Tropical diseases, of which malaria was just one, disabled nearly 2/3 of the division. Wounds caused by enemy fire accounted for only 1/3 of disabled Marines on Guadalcanal. Let's hear from Sid again as he recalls life on Guadalcanal and dealing with the lack of food and Japanese bombardments.
They were bad. They really were. The times when it would get the worst is there'd be no food that we had hoarded away. You know, sometimes we'd get a few cans of sea rations and we'd hoard them away, but we would run completely out of hoarded food, and there'd be nothing to do except stand in line for your 2 tablespoons of rice twice a day. And that's what you'd get. And they'd check the roll. I mean, you couldn't go through the line twice, but you'd get 2 tablespoons of that rice in the morning and 2 tablespoons in the afternoon. And we were really hungry. We really were. And the bombardments, the bombardments never let up. We were bombarded almost every night by Jap cruisers and destroyers, and one night by battleships. I didn't think we would ever survive that at all. It was unbelievable. It just went on and on and on and on and on. And the concussion was so tremendous that it would squeeze the breath out of you, you know. If you've ever had the breath knocked out of you playing football or something, you know, and you're gasping for breath, it was that after every salvo. It just knocked the breath out of you over and over. And we really thought we were dead. And these guys were praying out loud, and all the Catholics were hollering Hail Mary and all, you know. It wasn't funny. It's funny now, but it wasn't funny then, because I didn't think that anybody was going to survive. And when it all finally ended, I was surprised there weren't more casualties than there were. But if you're underground, you can survive almost anything. You just cannot even find words to describe a 14-inch shell going off, even a block away, you know. But they'd put that, we had a roof on that thing, and it would leap up into the air, and it would be as bright as noon on a desert every time it would leap up into the air like that. And all the dirt came off of it and down on us. We were sitting chest deep in dirt and couldn't get out of that dugout we had made, because we had an entrance trench and it was all plugged with dirt, and we had to come out through the roof. And I remember nobody said anything at all for about an hour, and then Ransom said, "I hope to hell Tojo doesn't get this idea again."
As Dr. Sid said, another unpleasant daily occurrence for the men ashore were Japanese bombardments. By night, the Japanese would shell the Marine positions, specifically targeting Henderson Field. Japanese destroyers and cruisers would send shell after shell at the Marines, causing men to scramble for dugouts and shelters. Most enemy shellings only lasted a few minutes and were relatively ineffective, more of a nuisance to the Marines than anything else. That description, however, could not be used for the Japanese bombardment on the night of October 14, 1942, that you just heard Sid talking about. On that night, the Japanese battleships Haruna and Kongo sailed up the slot and opened fire on Henderson Field with their 14-inch rifles. At 01:33 hours, the battle wagons opened fire, and for the next 83 minutes, hurled 970 heavy naval shells at Henderson Field and the surrounding area. 1,900-pound shells as large as a Volkswagen Beetle smashed into the Marine position, shaking everything from dental fillings to the emotional stability of the men themselves. The explosion sucked air out of lungs, and the concussion blew over trees and collapsed coconut log dugouts with ease. Men were buried alive in what they thought were safe shelters. While physical casualties were light as a result of the battleship shelling, mental casualties were high. Men emerged from the dugout shaking violently, eyes wide, ears bleeding, unable to hear anything or see straight. Blast concussion rendered many men helpless or disoriented for hours and even days after the attack. Veterans of the Tenarue River and Bloody Ridge battles from September, who had stared death directly in the face, all recalled the night of October 14th to be the most frightening night of the entire campaign. The 1st Marine Division was not the only unit on the canal, but they certainly get and absolutely deserve the lion's share of the credit for the campaign ashore. In the case of Guadalcanal, more than any other Marine Corps campaign of the war, the old breed endured and survived Guadalcanal. The hardships faced by the old breed on the canal were part of what made them legendary. Semper Fi. It wasn't until October that the 1st Army units arrived on the island. Inter-service rivalry between the Marines and soldiers was always present, but as you'll hear in this last clip from Sid, the Gyrenes were very happy to see their Army brothers.
We were glad to see them, to be truthful. In fact, there was one guy in my squad, and remarking about that, he said, we'd have been glad to see the little sisters of the poor come ashore if they'd had rifles and something to eat. He said, we were glad to see anybody.
As I said in the main episode, the campaign for Guadalcanal was unique to campaigns in the Pacific. It was really the only campaign throughout the entirety of the war that we actually had a very real chance of losing. All combat arms were involved in the struggle, and to be honest, I could and would love to talk about all of them in great detail, but alas, we don't have the time for that now. Hopefully we can do another Guadalcanal-related film soon, so I can relate the amazing stories of this incredibly heroic campaign. And with that being said, I want to thank you so much for listening. Be sure to tune in next week when we discuss the 2006 Iwo Jima epic, Flags of Our Fathers. Until then, you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer Mallory Kirk, and our sound engineer Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.